Steven Geiger, who is speaking on innovation today. Steven has undergraduate degree from MIT and MBA from Wharton. He was a founder and first director of Masdar, an Abu Dhabi-based innovation company in Holland. He was one of the founding members of the Skolkovo Foundation and chief operating officer, and he is the world-renowned authority on innovation. So about what with you, Steven.
Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here today and discuss about innovation. Even though this is a lecture, I would like this to be an open discussion. I think it's useful to bring to light some real-world experiences that I've had helping different governments around the world develop innovation and innovation centers, including Russia. If there's anything that you see when we're going through that doesn't make sense or you disagree with or you have questions about, just raise your hand and we'll answer. If it's really complex, we'll put it to the end when we have some open question and answers. So with that, let's get going. Topics I'd like to cover today, basically why are countries around the world, including Russia, all chasing innovation? What's the driving motivation for doing this? What are the common traps that I've seen in my experience helping different governments do this? Common traps and mistakes that they fall into when they're trying to develop innovation in innovation centers. And then, since we're in Russia, obviously, what are the specific challenges to innovation in Russia? And then finally, I'd like to leave with some recommendations to policymakers, how they can avoid some of these innovation traps that most countries are making. So let's start with the beginning. Why are countries pursuing innovation? What's so exciting about it that everyone's doing it? The main reason is pretty simple. It's to increase the prosperity of their country, increase the prosperity and living standards of their people. The primary way, unless you get lucky and happen to have a lot of oil and gas out in Siberia, you have to do it through economic growth. And economic growth is very closely linked to innovation, particularly technological innovation. I think history of civilization has shown pretty well entire civilizations have risen and fallen based on technology and innovation. There's also a national security component to innovation. Countries that don't develop their own technology have a hard time defending themselves. Your enemies are not going to sell you the latest technology. The third reason is also a fear of many countries of falling behind other countries in this great race, particularly in the 21st century. And the fourth reason, it's just trendy. Everybody wants to create a Google or a Facebook. So the first one and the main one is prosperity through economic growth. And make no mistake, prosperity doesn't come by accident. It's a function and a result of strategic planning, massive investments, very serious risk-taking, and innovation. Now this is a graph that's produced every year showing sort of the state of the world of research and development expenditures by various countries around the world. And you can see a clear axis red going up. So here you have R&D as a percent of the GDP of a country increasing, starting out at 0, ending up at 4.5. And on this axis you have the number of engineers and scientists per 1 million population. So basically the big blue blob is America, spends the most, about $430 billion this year in general R&D. The point I'd like to make here is all these up in this upper right quadrant who spend more than 2.5% of their GDP on R&D, they are all the rich countries of the world. They are the prosperous countries of the world. So is it chicken or egg? Are these countries up there because they're rich and they can afford R&D? Or did they get there because they invested in themselves and in R&D? I think it's a bit of both. Here's Russia. Russia is this gray circle here. So you can see that Russia is investing about 1.4% of its national GDP every year on R&D, which puts it about in the middle of the pack, but there's clear room for improvement. Quick look at how you break down the R&D in the U.S. How R&D is, where does the money come from and where does the money go to? Well, surprise, surprise, the government is the largest source of money. Industry is the largest source of money. These are the blue blocks here. They're the largest source and the largest consumer of research funding. The government, this gold block here, They actually fund about a third of all R&D in America, but they do a lot less than a third. They farm it out mainly to contract research at universities and institutes, and then also some contract research and partnerships with industry. Just to give you a little flavor of what top executives in America this year consider key technologies that are driving R&D, 53% answered biotech, then followed by renewable energy, bio-nanotech, IT, cloud computing, and so on. This gives you a flavor of what where the R&D dollars are going today in America. Another useful approach is McKinsey. They do every year what's called an innovation heat map, where they look at all the countries in the world and they try to map out innovation by each country, who's making progress, who's falling behind, who's just more or less staying in the same place. And the interesting things to point out here is, of course, McKinsey being McKinsey, they use some sexy terms like dynamic oceans and hot springs and silent lakes and shrinking pools, but their point is pretty simple. Down here, this axis, you have from low to high the diversity of innovation. That means how many different types of industries an innovation center or a country is a leader in. And on this axis is momentum, the growth every year in filing for patents. Now, okay, this is only one measure, so it is limited, but it's a very good one, because if you're not filing for patents, you're probably not creating a lot of IP. So, surprise, surprise, places like Silicon Valley have the bandwidth to not only be fairly high on patent growth and IP registration, but also diversity. They can do biotech, they can do cloud computing, they can do mobile. Now, a number of countries tend to be very specialist. They choose one or two areas to focus in, and that's really the bandwidth that they have, and they're very successful in it. Then a lot of countries are down here, and they're not really filing for a lot of IP patents. They're not really registering a lot of IP, and they also are not very able to make a broad attack on various technologies. So this is a useful tool. It's by far not the only answer to it, but just gives you a flavor for where countries are globally competing with each other in innovation. So there you have it. A lot of countries, virtually every country in the world is chasing innovation. On this map, I mapped out the red dots are what we can agree on are established, recognized, leading innovation centers. Now, innovation center could be a physical city or technopark, or it can also be more a general area. So naturally, you have places such as in the U.S., Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York. You have London, Germany, France, and Switzerland, Israel, Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Those are pretty much the globally accepted leaders in innovation. The interesting thing is there are a number of upstarts, a number of promising new countries and new technoparks and new innovation efforts, including here in Russia, Skolkovo, that are trying very aggressively to make a play to become a leader in the innovation game. So by country, even though Korea is a recognized innovation leader, they also have set up two specialized research innovation parks. One is called Daedok and one is called Sangbu. And they're different, focusing on different areas such as clean energy or biotech. In China, perhaps the biggest technopark in the world, outside Beijing, Zhongguancun, is also making some very strong strides to become a leader in innovation technology development. In Taiwan, you have Inshu and Tainan. They've been around for 20, 30 years. That's where the semiconductor manufacturers, world's leading semiconductor manufacturers like TSMC and UMC are based, as well as flat panel display makers down in Tainan. Malaysia's had a little bit of a struggle with it, frankly. They tried something called the Multimedia Super Corridor and another project called CEFIR, which really haven't delivered the results that the government was really hoping for a number of factors. Now, Singapore is an interesting case. Everybody tends to look at Singapore as this phenomenal, innovative country, and on many levels it is. But they are also realizing they want to branch out in new areas. So they've created, for biosciences, they want to become a world leader in biosciences. They've established the Biopolis, which it's too early to say whether it will be successful or not, but if it is, it'll make them a world leader in biosciences. India's made some great strides in Bangalore, you've all heard of, through their e-city and International Tech Park. My former home down in Abu Dhabi became a world leader in alternative energy and sustainable technologies through a program called Masdar. Down in South Africa, you have two hubs. One's called Innovation Hub in Pretoria, the capital, and then you have Stellenbosch Techno Park, which is affiliated with Stellenbosch, one of the leading universities down there. That's another fact to point out is most of the successful techno areas, techno parks, however you call it, innovation centers, always have a leading research university or two or three as the core of that ecosystem. And that's also the plan here with Skolkovo and the new Institute for Science and Technology. Over in, not a lot of activity in South America, although two projects are worth noting. Startup Chile, really interesting project. People would say Chile, they're not a real leader in innovation. They have set up a project that gives very small grants, $40,000, but it's done in an extremely professional manner and extremely businesslike. You fly in the first week you have an apartment, you have your visa sorted out, you have a working bank account with $40,000 in it to spend more or less as you please, you have an office space and an incubator, you are able to start work immediately in the first week. And that is highly successful. I would say on a dollar per dollar basis, probably the most successful innovation effort in the world. FinEp, also very instructive, I think, for Russia. They started about a decade and a half ago, and it's the agency, the equivalent of Skolkovo. It's a national strategic agency for innovation development for the Brazilian government. And they've made some great progress in basically building a venture capital community and a startup community that didn't exist when they kicked this off. And a woman named Patricia and her team have done a great job building that, and I think it's a great model that Russia can possibly learn from. Topping it off in America, despite the three main centers, you also have a couple startups in Austin, Texas, very interesting technology hub, and also in North Carolina you have a Research Triangle. So that gives you a flavor for the established players and some of the upcoming players in the innovation scene. Now, if only innovation were this easy, life would be simple. Here's your recipe, bring in the consultants, here's your game plan, and off you go and create your innovation city. Unfortunately, innovation is probably one of the most complex undertakings that any country, including Russia, is going to do. But that said, I think you'd be hard-pressed to look at any single endeavor that has more impact on the future of countries, particularly in Russia as well, than being able to successfully adapt to innovation and technology development. So, countries are chasing technology. Some are progressing, some are doing well, some are doing less well. What are some of the common traps that I've seen that they tend to fall into, and how to avoid them? Well, the first and foremost by far has to be, we must be like Silicon Valley. Everyone looks across the ocean, they see palm trees and Google and Facebook and companies that are worth more than Gazprom, and they say, we want that. We have to be like that. So the problem is they tend to just blindly copy the Silicon Valley model. And that's a mistake because Silicon Valley is not a physical place that can be copied. It's a culture. It's part of the American culture. It's part of the immigrant culture. It's part of the individualism of America. It's something that elements can be copied, but it's an entirety. It's a losing game. You simply cannot. It's not easy. It's probably impossible to copy a culture. And also, keep in mind timing. Silicon Valley originated in the early 50s with government funding, Department of Defense funding some of the early semiconductor companies, Fairchild, Shockley, National Semiconductor. That's how it started, 60 years ago of evolution to get it to where it is today. There's a lot of speculation whether that model is even relevant going forward. So the big question I have to governments, Russian government or other governments, is why are you trying to copy a model that may be outdated as you're copying it? It's going to take 10 or 20 years to get an innovation center really up and running and fully functioning, and it might be an outdated model that you're copying anyway. So that's something to also keep in mind, and not blindly copy somebody else's model. And the final point is, if you're always copying somebody, you're never ever going to lead, because you're waiting for a creative idea to borrow or do something with. You'll never come up with your idea. So my philosophy and my advice is find your own style, find the things that work within your culture, find the assets that your country has, leverage them. Let's take an example of copying. Here's the iPhone. China pretty much makes it, and they earn 2% of the sale price of that phone. There's a company called Apple that doesn't make it, but they do make the innovative IP that goes into it, and they make 50%, 50. Now, the question is very simple to countries like Russia. Which do you want to be? Do you want to be a China, or do you want to be an Apple? And I think the answer is fairly clear on this. The next trap I see a lot of these efforts fall into is we have to have our big, shiny new city because that's where the new, exciting stuff's going to happen. And I can understand the emotional attachment to trying to create a big, shiny city. It's much nicer than maybe an old, rundown building. But the bottom line is, if you've ever seen this American movie with Kevin Costner called Field of Dreams, and the storyline is very simple. The guy has a dream that if he builds a baseball park in his farmyard, all these heroes from the baseball team in 1919 will come back to life and start playing baseball in his backyard. In the movie it works, but unfortunately in real life it doesn't. So this Field of Dreams, and the line in there is, if we build it, they will come. And a lot of countries are taking this approach. If we build this fancy, new, beautiful, technological city, all these innovators will come, all these corporations will come, all these investors will come. The problem tends to be these things stay on paper. This is Masdar City. That building is not yet built after 6 years. This is Skolkovo. And I think there was a dome here that has been recently canceled, and this cube being questionable as well, given it only has 50% utilizable floor space. And this is Songdo in Korea, also still under construction. These things tend to stay on paper because they tend to be too expensive and too technologically challenging, and quite frankly, have very little to do with real innovation. Keep in mind, all these companies you see here, these were all built in a student dorm room or in a tiny garage. So Hewlett-Packard, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Dell, the who's who of tech world, they were done in dorm rooms and garages. They weren't done in a shiny billion-dollar city. Now, another problem that I've noticed is the desire to, well, if we copy all the various components of an innovation center, then suddenly it'll magically come to life. And that actually reminds me of the theory of biogenesis, which was developed by a famous Russian professor of chemistry at MGU back in the 20s, Alexander Aparin. And basically he came up with a theory that life originated in this primordial sea of ammonia with methane gas, and there were these primitive organic structures called coacervates that somehow biologically, chemically converted through some spark out of life into life. That was the theory back then. And I see this being applied to innovation efforts around the world as well. So let's bring in some corporate venture capital, let's bring in some big corporations, let's bring in some young scientists and smart people and entrepreneurs. Let's bring in some government, some IP services. Let's put all these things in play, and presto, like a cake, after 45 minutes in your oven, it will be ready to eat. It's a little more complicated than that. The magic just doesn't happen on its own, unfortunately. You have to make it happen. I like to think of this as this problem, I think, could be solved by approaching innovation and setting up innovation centers like Skolkovo from scratch. If you think of it like a Rubik's Cube. And next year, 2014, will be the 40th anniversary of the Rubik's Cube. So when I was reading that, I said, hey, this is something to talk about here. Basically, if you boil down an innovation center, you can end up with pretty much, I like to say, about 6 elements. You obviously have to have your entrepreneurs. They're the engine of it. You have to have your researchers and your academics at the universities who are doing research. You need a physical infrastructure where this stuff takes place. Yes, we've made modern, enormous strides in telecommunications, Skype, video, and all that, but there's nothing like personal proximity where you just go down the hall to another researcher, have a cup of coffee, and brainstorm on a new idea. You need the venture capital because they provide the money in the early stage risk projects. You also need the large corporations because they also provide some financing for research, and they also give you feedback to what the market is looking for at a certain point in time. And then, of course, you need the government policy and the government money. Now, these top 3 are all users of money, and these all 3 are contributors of money. And if you layer them on a cube, you end up with a 6-sided Rubik's Cube. Now, the problem is, Each one of these are very different communities. They have their own desires, their own needs. They only look at their own issues. And if you make any change to that cube, if you've ever done a Rubik's Cube, you can end up, a couple changes and you'll end up with something like that pretty quickly. Or worse, you'll end up with that, a broken cube. It looks tantalizingly simple. That's the internal mechanism of a Rubik's Cube. It looks pretty easy, but anyone who's tried to crack this thing realizes it's not so simple. So getting back to how you can apply that to designing, building, and managing an innovation center, you have to take a holistic approach. When you're making a policy, for example, IP policy, you have to understand how is that going to impact VCs, how is that going to impact entrepreneurs, how is that going to impact research community. When you're making a policy about who you let into your innovation center or who you don't, you have to take a holistic approach. How every community on that cube is going to be affected by any change. It's not easy, and experience definitely helps. You make your mistakes on somebody else's cube, and then you can get a little better at the next cube. So I like to think of innovation as a Rubik's Cube. Now, what are some of the specific challenges to innovation in Russia? Well, let's start off. The first one is, in the general rankings of global innovation, Russia ranks 51. So it's not really starting off from a great position. And that also affects international perception of whether they want to invest their money in this country. Everybody knows and everybody's heard about the great minds of Russia. Anyone who's worked here for many years understands that's absolutely true. But unfortunately, outside perceptions, money capital can go anywhere in the world now. It's entirely fungible. And brains, smart people, can go anywhere as well, to where they're best treated and rewarded. So Russia's going to have to make some major steps to improve itself on the rankings, to get its perception and its reality of being a place where real innovation can happen. Otherwise, the smartest people will continue to leave, and the smart money will not come in to fund perhaps the next Google or the next groundbreaking technology. But it's not all bad news. There's some good news here. This is also the same organization, the World Intellectual Property, WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, every year produces this ranking of all innovation around the world. Russia's about here. It's just right below this trend line, which means that's good. It means it has reasonable chances to improve. And this trend line shows GDP per capita on this axis and your ranking. So naturally you have the leaders in innovation. Up here you have this curve. Basically, these are countries that are simply too poor to be innovative. They're busy with sort of Maslow's hierarchy, food, water, shelter, things like that. Then these are the growth curve countries. You see India here and China, they're what they call the learners. They're learning how to innovate, and they're learning how to invest. And then this group is sort of the underperformers that really have the means and the tools to be innovative. They're simply not maximizing what they have. So if you can see, Russia right here is almost outside of that group of underperformers and right almost on the trend line. So that's good news. Russia can become, can radically improve its innovational environment with a few key steps. Yeah, again, if you have any questions or comments, please take the microphone.
Yeah, just one small question. How is the efficiency measured in this graph? I mean, I didn't get it.
They try to, basically they start with innovation ranking, and they have two main elements of that. The first one is your innovation inputs of your country, and the second is the innovation outputs of a country. So innovation inputs of a country would be your population, it would be the educational level of your population, it would be the quality of university education, quality of research, Academy of Sciences, it would be laws, do you have rule of law, protection, IP courts, things like that. Is it stable? How fast can you fire a worker? Can people get visas? All these are factor inputs into your ranking. And then the second piece, your output, is what that country produces in innovation. And that's typically measured by patents, registered patents, licensing, revenues from those patents and licensing, like the case with Apple, exports of high technology goods. So it's fairly complex. They take that numerator and they divide it by the denominator, and they end up, that's how you get your efficiency ranking. So basically, they're saying the countries here that the countries here, this is per capita, the rich countries, the countries that have a lot should be able to be high on the ranking because they have a lot. If you're not utilizing your assets as well as you could, and you're in this group here. If you don't have a lot, but you're sort of like Manny Pacquiao, you're punching above your weight, you're in this group, like India and China. They're relatively poor, $3,000, $4,000 a year per capita income, but they rank relatively high, here's China, relatively high on the innovation index. Interesting point, take Singapore, it's this little dot there. And then if you can see it on the slide handouts, these are red circles and they're inefficient. They rank Singapore as an inefficient innovator, which is surprising, but when you study it, you understand because Singapore ranks number one on the input side. They have virtually everything that you need to really do innovation, but they're really not generating a proportionate amount of IP products and technologies that you would expect out of that. And that's why, even though they're very rich and very high, they could be even high. They should be even higher. They're considered an underperformer, so it's strange. Now, I don't think we can have an honest discussion about innovation in Russia if we don't talk about the C word, corruption. And I think Nikolai said it best when he visited some he visited some Russian emigres in the 1790s in Paris, and they asked him, they challenged him to describe Russia in 2 words. Well, he outdid it. He did it in 1 word, Varut. Let's be very clear. Innovation and current innovation attempts in Russia will not succeed. They will struggle if the current levels of corruption in Russia are maintained. Let's just be very clear about that. And the reality is very simple, is because we're dealing with a new type of asset. It's an intellectual asset. It's a fungible asset. It's not an oil and gas well in Siberia that physically can't be taken away. It's a smart guy or woman who is in this room who gets frustrated and says, and they get on a plane and they go to a country that accepts them, rewards them, allows them to pursue their ideas. So if this problem isn't tackled, you can expect the brain drain to continue and you can expect it to accelerate. And that's why, in my opinion, the state innovation initiatives that do exist, such as Skolkovo, they have to be the vanguard of honesty and transparency. And they've made some very strong efforts to do that. I think they could do more, but they need to be the vanguard of transparency and openness. Any questions on this slide? Okay. Now, another thing that's specific to Russia. Russia has a need to close a gap. I'll explain on the next slide. This describes the normal technology life cycle. You have an S-curve where technologies are developed either in basic research or entrepreneurs, somebody's garage, dorm room. Then they go through applied research. Then early VC picks them up. They're highly risky. They're not ready for the market. They gain maturity, little market acceptance. And then finally private equity or the IPO. And then the technology becomes mature. Large corporations take it over and it's commoditized. That's a normal environment globally. This is Russia's situation. There's a gap. And this is a reality of the system that was inherited from the Soviet Union. It's a reality of the separation of research and education. And there is whatever you want to call it, it's a gap between research and commercialization and the market needs. So these guys are in their Academy of Sciences and they're not really talking to the market what you really need. What do you want us to research? What do you want us to focus on? What do you want us to, they're not talking to a VC saying, I want this technology or that technology in the next 3 to 5 years. And that's what's missing. And the result is pretty simple. Weak commercialization of this enormous base of Russian ideas and technologies. Yeah.
Just a small question. Is the slide precise? I mean, with this part of entrepreneurships, do we have this part?
It's not drawn to scale. It's a chart. It just shows that technologies typically come out of some research activity at an institute or university, or they come out as a startup from an entrepreneur. These are 2 sources of startups.
Yeah, but from your experience working in Russia, do we have any entrepreneur research startups?
Yes, of course. You do, yes. Skolkovo in 2 years attracted 700 startups. There are startups. Some of them are relatively large startups, and some of them are 2-3 people. So Russia has a lot of startups, and Russia could have even more startups. I don't think that's the problem. Getting startups isn't the problem. providing them the linkages to carry them through these early days called the Valley of Death in Silicon Valley. This is the Valley of Death where your technology is not ready for the market to absorb, but you don't have enough money to ramp it up or to pay your employees. So that's where the venture capitalists come in. That's where risk capital, angel financing, government grants, for example, from Skolkovo come in to plug that gap to allow you to either prove yourself useless and die, or prove yourself useful and succeed and carry on. But as long as that gap is there, ideas will never make it through there. They'll simply die stillborn. Now, the solution is fairly simple. The problem is the gap. The solution is to fill the gap. You fill the gap with these pieces. So you have your university and research components, you have your corporates, you have your VC and angel investors, and you have your entrepreneurs. It has to be supported intensely by government policy and financial support. And then you also need a competitive infrastructure, getting back on the non-competitive big shiny cities. It doesn't do any good to build a multi-billion-dollar city if it's too expensive for the average entrepreneur to rent space there. No one can afford it. So keep it real, keep it competitive. Another weakness...
sorry, may I ask a question?
Yes.
So, could you tell us, please, why we actually have this gap in Russia? I mean, because of Voruyev or what?
No. This gap exists primarily because of the traditional separation between research elements that were traditionally handled by the Academy of Sciences and education, which were, let me go back, and education, which were handled by the universities, the WUZs, and the institutes. That's one piece to the problem. And the other problem was there was no market economy until 1991. So there was only one buyer, the state. There was only order from Gosakaz. So this is a result of the Soviet command economy. There was no market signals coming from people. There were no venture capitalists. I guess the prototype of the venture capitalist, that was, I guess, a venture capitalist in some sense. But you simply didn't have the market economy. That's why this gap exists. And other command economies also face similar problems doing this, closing this gap, bringing the market signals closer to the researchers so they know what to research, and the money is channeled to people who are doing something productive and not people who are just doing pie-in-the-sky research.
Thank you.
Another question is... Another question is whether we had, and possibly might have, some links between the basic research and the light corporations. I mean, now in our economy, the government tends to create monsters like Rosneft or some others. So the question is whether they innovate in terms of the link between the research and their innovation.
They absolutely should. They don't do it now. And it's the goal of organizations like Skolkovo and others to begin to educate the main Russian corporations on the advantages of doing contract research at the universities. Again, this is new for them as well. Imagine yourself, you're the vice president of Gazprom or Rosneft. You're saying, why should I invest, hundreds of millions of dollars like Exxon or Halliburton does? It's something that organizations need to make the case to these corporations and show them it's a win-win situation. Well, actually, Gazprom, you might want to invest a couple $100 million in this new university because these are the leading researchers in the world in your technology. And working with your scientists, you actually may gain some competitive advantage that allows your company to progress. And therefore, it's a very smart investment. In fact, everybody else in the world, all your competitors are doing it. It's a learning process. Hopefully organizations like Skolkovo and others can accelerate that learning process because without the participation of leading Russian corporations in funding research at the main universities, plugging that gap is going to take a lot longer than it needs to.
Hello. And the way how to leverage all this basic research and entrepreneurs only through financial loans, only through venture capital and private equity goods. no any other way?
No, no, of course not. You have government funding. That's one of the main sources of financing of research around the world are government programs. For example, in America, you have National Science Foundation that provides significant grants. You have the Defense Department that provides significant grants to places like MIT and Stanford and Caltech and Berkeley and all these leaders in education and research. So industry finances research at these institutes. Venture capital, they really don't like financing research per se. They like waiting for the candy to come out of the machine and then go off with it. So it's mainly government programs that fund research. It's in industry programs that fund sponsored research in their specific area of interest. For example, BP is spending $500 million just at Stanford, just in biotech, biofuels, British Petroleum, because they see that's a competitive advantage. So it's not just the VCs and private equity guys. No, they're funding more the startups. They're funding more the entrepreneurs. The basic research is done usually by the state. It takes too long. The window is 10, 15 years for basic research to possibly make it to market. That's far too long for any private investor. That's why it has to be the state that finances that. But when you're talking about applied research...
to be successful in this research, what kind of skills do you have to find a company and right entrepreneurs? Do you have to have skills as a private equity guys have or how you can be successful in that? The big multinational companies, they just don't have, I think, skills to find the right ideas. They don't have institutes, they don't have corporate research centers, nothing.
You're speaking here in Russia? Here in Russia specifically?
Yes.
Well, this all adds up to why there's this gap. These are all components of why there's a gap and the need to close that gap through various programs. VCs will play their role, the government will play its role, the researchers have to play the role. They have to proactively go out and start talking to potential investors to test their ideas. They just can't sit in a laboratory waiting for somebody to knock on their door. So I think both sides need to be more proactive and hopefully they'll meet at some point in the middle faster.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that we are stacking on this problem, but I think it's the biggest problem in Russia. So, okay, my question is we have a second, I think the second big problem is no business angels, because there are no people who have a background of startups and who knows how hard to find money on the first stage, and we have no way to get money just for your future, because many people don't have big prospects in their business, and they don't want to put money on Russian projects in Russia because they don't believe it can be returned after 5 or 10 years. And maybe you know some way to fill this gap other way just than the private capital, private from the pockets of other capitalists.
Well, the angel community plays a critical role here. They step in even before the venture, even before the earliest, most risk-taking venture capitalists will step in. The angel, that's typically your friends, your family, and some very nice people that tend to be the angels. There is a nascent community here, very early stages of an angel community here. It will take time to develop. It will take probably at least 5 to 10 years to develop a working, dynamic angel community, and that's just the realities. What can be done is for all sides in this puzzle, for the researchers, the VCs, the university, the students, for everybody to try to accelerate that process, to become angels themselves, to possibly become mentors, to everyone take a more active role in developing that community. Because that community, once it's fully developed, it will be able to handle and process a lot more of Russian ideas and technologies than that will otherwise just simply fall through the cracks and not be addressed. So it's a process. It will take time, but the good news is it's already developing, and it's developing at a pretty good speed.
So, is there any tools in Skolkovo for this early
Skolkovo is an angel investor. Skolkovo invests in 4 different stages, including the very earliest stage of basically a business plan. So Skolkovo and other organizations act as angel investors. I believe Bortnick Fund and others that do almost like a microfinance type of structure. They are, you could call them, internationally they would be the equivalent of angel investors. But definitely there needs to be a lot more of angel investors, and there need to be successful Russian entrepreneurs who, after they make their success, they don't just sit on an island, they actually get back into the community and they start transferring their skills, their knowledge, and their capital to the next generation of successful entrepreneurs. That is critical, and hopefully the Russian entrepreneurs that do become successful will feel that calling and take up that role.
Hello, you say that the leading Russian companies don't innovate, and you say that this is because they don't understand the benefits of innovation. But probably this is because they are state companies and they have some kind of distorted stimuli. They probably they get no profit from innovation. No, I think that this is because it's kind of irrational. Yes.
Well, Lukoil is not a state company. You're right. Gazprom, Rosneft, these are state companies, and Rostechnology, and all these are state companies. It's new to them. They're also state companies. These are reasons why they don't invest as much as they should in R&D and innovation. The private companies, they really don't have an excuse. They should be investing more because they're private companies trying to maximize the benefit for their shareholders. And just like their counterparts internationally, investment in innovation in technology in their key areas of business is a major competitive advantage they should be doing. Again, I'd like to emphasize this is a process. It's not going to happen overnight. The problem wasn't created overnight. The solution's not going to happen overnight. It is a process, and people should be lobbying their colleagues, their government officials, people who determine policy both in the government and in those companies. They should be investing more money in innovative R&D. But it will take time. One more question and then we'll continue on.
Okay, sorry. Another question is, to be honest, do we have the problem that from the government side, I mean, maybe there are some big guys who don't want you to grow up and they might restrict you to be a successful competitor. So do we have such kind of problem in Russia?
I can't comment on that. All I can say is, in my personal opinion, in the opinion of I think a lot of others, few areas could be as critical to the future of Russia as successfully mastering modern innovation and spreading it through the economy of Russia. So either Russia embraces innovation and benefits across its economy and becomes one of those people in that upper right quadrant, or the economy and the country will stagnate.
Thank you.
So, weaknesses in projects like Skolkovo. No one likes criticism. I hate criticism. But I spent 2 years as the chief operating officer of Skolkovo, and I saw 3 or 4 main problems. The good news is they're all relatively simple problems that, with the will, they can be fixed. If anybody's really interested, you can go to this link here. It was in RBK Daily, and pretty much I lay out the case. In my opinion, and again, I stress this is my opinion, there have been some phenomenal things that have been accomplished by Skolkovo, but even its existence deserves enormous credit to the people and the policymakers who thought it up and created it. It's not easy to have the courage to be able to create something this large with so much potential impact, knowing that enormous mistakes will be made along the way. So that's my disclaimer. I think there's a lot of good, and I just want to try to improve it if I can. I think the first way that the projects or similar national strategic initiatives can be improved is to focus on scope. If you go back to that McKinsey slide where certain countries were focusing on 1 or 2 areas and they were really good at it, up in that corner. They were up in that corner. Whereas places that had the bandwidth, the capacity to do a lot well, like Silicon Valley, they were doing a lot well. I think in early stages, even though Russia has enormous scientific technical depth in many areas, I don't think it makes sense to have it all managed under one roof. particularly if you look at how Skolkovo was created, it has, in my opinion, almost a impossible task of trying to generate efficient innovation in 5 enormous sectors of the economy. Each one deserves its own Skolkovo. So they're trying to lead successful innovation in IT and all the subsets of IT, in bioscience and biotech and all the subset areas of that, in energy, all the subset of energies, conventional energy, new energy, atomic, oil and gas, renewable, solar. They're trying to do space, and they're trying to do the nuclear industry, all in one organization, under one roof, with a unified set of policies on investment. The problem is each one of those industries are fundamentally different from each other, and it's very difficult to have a unified approach to each one of these. In particular, nuclear and space are very problematic because they've been monopolized by the state, and they also are very unlikely to have a high degree of foreign collaboration for national security reasons. So, in my opinion, I think projects like Skolkovo could be improved if areas such as space and nuclear had their own approach, their own organizations that were tailored to the specific needs of those industries. And then Skolkovo focused on, for example, IT and energy, possibly a little bioscience. I think that would be a recommendation. I think there would be much more success in it. The second is a misalignment of interest between the shareholder, the government, and the management. Until last month, I was working in Skolkovo, so I can still say we. The management there has performance indicators that are more numerical than qualitative. And because it was originally envisioned to be a non-profit entity for reasons that were entirely legitimate, the reality is the management doesn't have a direct financial interest in the companies that it's trying to support. And just human nature, you're much more excited about going to work if you're going to build a Facebook. Secretaries at Facebook are multimillionaires. Trust me, they're very excited going to work. So we came across this very same issue down in Abu Dhabi. Where the government owned the project, and we were going to set up a clean tech investment fund, $250 million, and we went to the leadership and we explained that, look, we're managing your money. You should want us to be interested in the outcome of that. They thought about that and they said, yeah. And so we came to a compromise. They didn't give us the pure market returns that we would get working in a private equity fund or VC fund, but we also got more than just being a government employee with maybe a bonus at the end of the year. We got an interest in the success of those companies. So one way or another, I think to get a motivated group of people to really care about the companies that they're developing, whether they succeed or not, you have to find a way to, through setting up some quasi type of venture fund, I think is the best way, to allow the managers in these initiatives to have a direct interest in those companies. I think you're just trying to fight human nature if you don't do that. The third one is, we discussed it already, don't focus on building a shiny new city. Focus on building only the infrastructure that directly supports innovation and is affordable. And the last one is lack of internationalization. There's an organization in America called the Kauffman Institute, and they do a regular study on competitiveness and innovation. They looked at Silicon Valley startups, and they determined that fully 50%, half of all Silicon Valley startups were either created by or have key managers that are not American, that are foreigners on visas or are new immigrants. And that's a shocking fact to a lot of Americans, that half of Silicon Valley's great success that the rest of the world's trying to model was created by foreigners. So the reality is technology and innovation in the 21st century is inherently international. It's collaboration around the world. And the best and the brightest will go to those environments in those countries where they get rewarded. So if initiatives like Skolkovo or other projects in other countries want to really compete with Silicon Valley and succeed, they have to increase their level of internationalization. If they don't, they're simply going to be behind the other organizations that are basically attracting talent and ideas from around the world. So these are just some ideas. The good news, like I said, these are problems that can be relatively solved if there's the will to do so.
Excuse me, just a small remark about the lack of...
Just a small remark about that it's not difficult to solve the lack of internationalization in Russia. I mean, to create competitive environment for people and intelligent, smart entrepreneurs, I don't believe that it's an easy task, because it's the overall like institutions and all the things, and stealing, corruption, and all the other facts that do you really believe that they are easy to solve?
I'm not talking about those issues. I'm talking about the management of the organizations that have the mandate and the task to develop successful innovation in Russia, such as Skolkovo. There's a management structure at these different organizations, and it's not difficult to hire international specialists to do those jobs. If you take, for example, the new university that is being set up in partnership with MIT, Skolkovo Institute of Technology, you have a foreign president, and you have half of the senior management are foreigners. And that organization will be successful because it's taking an international approach. It also has a very good partner to work with. We did the same thing in Abu Dhabi. We partnered with MIT to set up the same university in a country that has 400,000 citizens, virtually no technology, no IP, and honestly, 50 years ago, we're living in tents in the desert. And that university is up and running and producing world-class researchers and world-class patents and IP today. It started in 2006, so I know that the Skolkovo Institute of Technology and Science will be successful. But again, these projects have to involve international approaches, because the world is collaborative today. Researchers and students and entrepreneurs, they're collaborating with people around the world. If you try to put a wall around this process, you're going to end up with a stagnant pond. It won't happen overnight, but I think it's just a recommendation that it needs to take a greater approach for internationalization. So, let's wrap it up with some recommendations for successful innovation. Don't force the glass slipper. You've all seen Cinderella, the movie. Cinderella meets the prince, she runs away, loses her little glass shoe, and then the prince is looking for her, and he comes into her house, knocks on her door, and of course her sisters try to stick their fat little foot in the slipper and marry the prince. It doesn't work, only for Cinderella it fits. The point is, innovation can't be forced, but it can be encouraged. And just accept that Silicon Valley was a rare, perhaps unique set of converging factors that simply can't be repeated or copied. And you should really focus on leveraging your own culture, leveraging your own strengths, and don't blindly imitate people trying to force something. The second, be careful what you wish for. It says up here, I wish to have the body that all women want. And he gets it. So when you're talking about what you want to copy Silicon Valley, be careful, because again, it's a culture you're copying, and is that culture going to work with your existing culture? Think about it. Carrying on this idea, can you really handle the truth about innovation? This is a great movie. I think it was called A Few Good Men, with Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise, Demi Moore. And basically the bottom line was, these guys are soldiers living in Guantanamo, defending a U.S. base in Cuba, 100 meters away from enemy troops every day, staring down the barrel of a gun. They have a slightly different approach to life than somebody sitting in a nice, comfortable Starbucks somewhere. And the bottom line is, look at innovation without rose-colored glasses. Innovation requires great individual freedom. Are you, as a country, are you as a culture, ready to accept that? It requires tolerating unconventional ideas and lifestyles. I was advising a conservative Middle East Muslim country on setting up one of these structures, and we got into this issue. And I just said, let me give you two examples that people attribute the success to Silicon Valley. First, tolerance for alternative lifestyles, i.e. homosexuals. People programming naked at 4 o'clock in the morning at their computer terminal. Are you ready to really accept that? And so when you start thinking about it, some cultures should take bits and pieces of the Silicon Valley model that fit with their culture and then leverage their strengths. If you try to import it again, you may not be able to do it. It requires open exchange of information and ideas. Is the country or the culture ready to do that? It requires a high tolerance for failure. This is a problem for almost every country and culture around the world. There's something unique of California. Even in Boston, it lags behind Silicon Valley. Even in the same country, because the culture is more conservative. People are more afraid to fail. When you get into conservative countries like the Middle East, Asia, where failing in business is losing face for your entire clan, your family, it becomes a very big issue. And that has to be addressed, because if you're not willing to fail, you're not going to innovate. It requires successive innovation. One person in a million might get lucky if he borrows somebody's idea in a Harvard dorm room. But most of us have to struggle and fail. And that requires high risk-taking. You have to have a culture that supports risk-taking. You have to have a culture that supports that finances that understands this is just part of the innovative process. In short, innovation is freedom. And can you handle that? We're almost finished, so let me just get to the end, okay? My next recommendation for countries doing innovation is set stretch goals, but make them achievable. Let's take our case of UAE, Abu Dhabi. Can this tiny little oil shale dump, 400,000 citizens in Abu Dhabi, polluting oil and gas, can they become a world leader in clean tech and sustainability? When we started, not a lot of people thought that they really thought that we were smoking something. But it turned out we ended up building the world's largest offshore wind farm, the world's largest operating solar thermal plant, the world's first solar thermal plant using innovative new technology, molten salt as a transfer fluid, the world's first graduate level research university dedicated to renewable energy, Mazda Institute together with MIT, the world's largest renewable energy conference in Expo that gets every January 25,000 visitors. And finally, icing on the cake, the UN awarded us with the world headquarters for the new agency for renewable energy. So this great new exciting industry of the future, renewable energy, Abu Dhabi won this. 4 years earlier, they were blowing smoke up a pipe. So things can be done if you have a strategy, if you have the resources, you have total support from the top, and if you have the right team that executes, you can achieve quite a lot. And then my last advice, don't blindly follow the experts. Nice shoes, Albert. Experts are useful, consultants are useful, they can help you flesh out what works, what doesn't, but ultimately, you really have to do it yourself. Don't blindly follow, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a government policymaker, whether you are a corporate leader. Listen to the experts, but don't blindly follow their advice. And that's it. Open for questions. We can leave Albert up there if you like.
I've got a question about the third, with the enumeration. The previous one. The question is about China. As far as I understand, their culture is not completely in line with all these ideas like individual freedom and all the other things, but you've shown that first of all they are now like above the trend with the efficiency of innovation, and then as far as I know many international companies try to create their R&D centers in China nowadays, so maybe it's a contradiction to this statement.
Well, a couple points. First is, this is honestly a American-centric model of innovation. Secondly, name one Chinese technology invented by Chinese that has dominated the world, other than gunpowder. Name one. They're very good at borrowing, copying, and reproducing cheaply, like the iPhone. Have they created an iPhone or an iPad? They're on the road to do that. It's a learning curve. And you're right, different cultures, in fact, most cultures do not have this strong individualism. This is a very unique American approach and even a European approach to some degree. Most cultures are traditional. Most cultures are more, shall we say, the value is the community, not the individual. And so they will be able to do innovation, yes. Singapore, for example, they are making some roads to innovation, but they also could do a lot more if they empower the individual more. Russia is an interesting case because you have a strong heritage of communal thinking, but you also have strong individual thinking as well, good and bad. So it's interesting to see how Russia will turn out, because I think they combine both elements of individualism as well as collectivism in one country. So I think it's pretty exciting to see how it will turn out here.
So could you help me please to solve the following contradiction? Like you said that you shouldn't copy the Silicon Valley, you should have your own culture. And on the other hand, you said just like you need the international management, like know your own culture. So the old people like from abroad. So how can we make our own culture?
You work with people, for example, in Abu Dhabi. 4 out of the top 5 managers at the beginning of 5 were foreigners. 3 years later, probably 20% of top managers were foreigners. Basically, government and leadership makes it very clear that we're bringing in expertise, but you're not going to stay here forever. Bring in expertise, you transfer that knowledge, you transfer that expertise to people locally who infinitely know the country better and are able to work within it than any foreigner. And once they have that knowledge plus the local knowledge, they're going to be able to make the inputs of their innovation system work much better than a foreigner. So it's not a contradiction. It's basically to kickstart the program, you need somebody to give you a roadmap to show you, okay, here's what you need to do. But there has to be a pretty clear understanding on both sides that this is a temporary setup, that there will be a need to transfer that knowledge as soon as physically possible to the local capacity. And the local capacity has to play their role in absorbing that international knowledge, and then when the time comes, putting on the hat and becoming the leader and taking over and leading it. And that doesn't mean that the collaboration stops. No, it means that, for example, in the case of Chile, you bring in all these people from around the world. Some stay, maybe 20%, 30% stay after the year is up and the money's gone. But most of them, when they go back to their home countries, they continue to maintain ties with Chilean organizations and people because they develop friendships, they develop collaborations. And that can happen in Russia as well. But if you don't start off with somebody that can show you how to build a house, if you want to go out and try to build a house on your own, you can build a house. You might not want to live on the 3rd or 4th floor, though.
I have a question. Okay, what were the most successful projects done in Skolkovo so far?
I think that the project itself that it was launched is a great success. And it's so easy to criticize. It's so easy to just be negative. But honestly, stepping back now that I'm out of it, even 1 month, and have the ability to respect that this is a major step forward for Russia. It's Russia as a government, Russia as a society, Russia as the academic community, the research community, the financial community, the corporate community, all these groups coming together and recognizing that we need to do something in innovation. We need to work together to do this. Startups, now there is a place to go. Somebody might listen to your crazy idea that wouldn't listen before. You may not get the money that you were hoping for. You can't finance everybody. But at least there's somebody that gives you the time of day, gives you the respect to listen to your idea, possibly introduces you to somebody else that can help you. That, I think, is the greatest achievement. There are over 700 startups that are in the system. There are 25 partnerships with the who's who of the world technology groups. There's the new university together with MIT that already has students and staff and is doing research projects. It's on a virtual level. It's not even one brick in the ground. These are success stories that unfortunately don't make it into the popular understanding and into perhaps some of the newspapers. But those are success stories. Certainly there's a lot of mistakes along the way, but I think on balance it's a major achievement just to get the project launched. And whoever launched it and supported it at the beginning and continually deserves all the credit for taking that risky step.
Thank you.
And to continue the previous question, but in a bit different way, what can prevent all those successful entrepreneurs and scientists who you first found and financed from migrating to the more competitive environment, to the more nice environment where they can live and communicate and continue their projects? And the more general question, whether it's possible to create this model, of the total cycle from the very beginning when the government, in Russian case, can finance the startups, but then they do not have any barriers and shouldn't have any barriers to migrate and to move their innovations and abroad.
Okay. The first question, how do you prevent a brain drain? Basically, you can. You can only attract people to stay. The good news is, in every culture, in every country, the vast majority of people prefer to continue living in the country of their birth. It's only in the rare cases where they're so frustrated that they're willing to cut ties, lose that familiar ground, and emigrate to another country. So the good news is Russians want to live and stay in Russia if it works for them and they can chase their dream and they can monetize their dream and they can feel safe and protected. They want to live here. It's their country. It's their culture. They feel comfortable here. Just as every culture feels that way. That's the good news. All organizations like Skolkovo have to do is to be very efficient in trying to make them be able to chase their dreams as easily as possible, to give them the most reason to stay. You can't, they'll always, it's like when you boil water on a stove. There'll always be a few molecules that escape, but most of the water stays in there boiling because that's physics. You can't stop the person who is just bent on leaving. Let them go. They may return if you have the ability to attract them. You should focus on what is causing people to leave. Causing people to leave is they're not getting respect for their ideas, they're not getting the ability to monetize their ideas because IP legislation is inefficient, because corruption, because they don't feel defensible, they don't have funding, the communities, angel, VC, government don't exist. All these problems can be solved over time. And it's the task and the mandate of groups like Skolkovo and others to do that. So to answer your first question, I think over time, as these entrepreneurs see that there are the tools that they could get somewhere else, they can get them here and maintain the comfort of their home, they'll stay. And secondly, you'll be able to attract the international talent when they say, hey, wait a second, here's an interesting opportunity. There's government support, there's government financing, there's access to some of the world's best scientists at an affordable price, and there's this enormous emerging market that I can sell my product into if it works. So you're starting to see a lot of foreign interest into it. But, for example, when I go to Silicon Valley, the first thing anyone asks is, when are they going to modify the visa law? Honestly, these guys and women are used to just going down the road 30 minutes and investing in a startup. To get them to get on a plane and fly over to any country, not just Russia, it's a big pain. And then if they have to go through this complicated visa process and then get ripped off at some hotel that charges $500 a night, they just say, forget that country. That's what they'll do. So there's a number of improvements across the board that can be made here that will not only retain the local talent and develop it and give it a chance to create world-class companies and technologies, but also begin more and more to attract international talent.
So one general, philosophical question about innovation. I want to talk about the consumer society. The bad side of the innovation that it helps to improve the capacity of some manufacturing processes. It optimizes the process. So we have more FMCG products, and people start buying more for no reason. So, and two questions for you. Do you believe this is actually the problem in the society at all? And the second point, if yes, so could you make any recommendation on that?
Are you talking about consumerism? I'm not really sure I see the connection to innovation, so I can't really answer it. Sorry.
My question is about compare Zelenograd and Skolkovo. Do you know in the USSR have the same project? It's Zelenograd Innovation Center in USSR. What has changed from this time? Why Skolkovo should be successful compared to Zelenograd? What is your opinion?
This is an issue that has been discussed many times in many layers. We have all these existing science cities in Russia. Why do we need to create this brand new thing, particularly a very expensive brand new thing? And that's a legitimate question. And the answer is, if you can, you should do both. You should continue to fund the existing science centers in a more intelligent way by making them more, make the grants on a competitive basis and not just an annual, here's your annual grant. Basically, have the science cities that do exist justify their existence publish IP, license technology, and show that they're worthy of receiving grants. That's how the funding model works in every country, is various researchers compete. They submit proposals and they compete. There's a jury of impartial people that judge the merits of each research project and proposal, and then a limited amount of money of government financing, and it's always limited, goes to those projects based on their merit. That can be done here as well. It's done to some degree. I think it could be improved. The argument for, so my point is, just because you're building a new thing like Skolkovo, you shouldn't just ignore all the existing and cut off the funding of all the existing science centers. No, because they already have been built, there's infrastructure there, and it should be leveraged. The issue though is, if you're really trying to kickstart a system fast, sometimes it's just easier to build it new. For example, let's take a marriage. Let's say you're not getting along with your spouse. Sometimes you think, oh, it's just easier to get a divorce and start new with somebody new. And I think in some sense, there's also that these existing science centers, these existing Ugagoda, they have a lot of embedded problems. And I think these are well known to everyone. They have embedded problems that it's very difficult and will take a lot of time to slowly change. And for better or worse, I think the government wants to see some fast change, and they view that some of the fastest change can come from starting from scratch. But I do believe a balanced approach is probably the best.
I know some problem was go from center of Moscow, go to Zelenograd. Skolkovo have the same problem, because a lot of scientists institute here in Leninsky Prospect. And how, for example, people go to Skolkovo from this place? No, scientists, people.
If the issue is competition, I think it's hard to defend lack of competition. Don't be afraid of a new competitor. The new competitor will raise the bar and the standard. Yes, there will be some winners and there will be some losers, but overall the country will win because money will be directed to the most deserving entities, whether they're the most deserving researchers or entrepreneurs, whether they're at some Siberian institute or whether they're at the new institute in Moscow. The issue is not having one or the other. The issue is, if you have a fixed block of government money that should be distributed you should distribute it on the basis of merit. And competition will only allow, if you can't compete with a startup innovation center in your own country, how are you going to compete with the rest of the world?
Okay, can I ask a question here? So being myself an entrepreneur, I would say that the most important thing for me to start a business is the market volume. It's actually more important than infrastructure or access to capital, and so there is no surprise that in Abu Dhabi they have energy-linked companies that is like startups, and actually in all countries that was on your map, maybe just Chile is pretty small, right? And the Chile is not making like innovation center, is just making some help. So my question is about Russia. So Russia is it's not the United Arab Emirates, but it has a comparatively small consumer market. It's like 6% of USA market. So actually, every entrepreneur here, when it thinks about starting something, is thinking why not to start it in the United States, because they're just so much bigger. So what do you think? Is this a problem for Russia, that the consumer market is like quite small, or we don't?
Absolutely not. It's the exact opposite. One of Russia's strongest attractions is the large consumer market, an undeveloped consumer market. That's attracting not only Russian entrepreneurs, it's attracting international entrepreneurs. Yes, America has a very large market, but trust me, it's enormously competitive. The beauty of the Russian market, because it's undeveloped, but yet it's large and incomes are growing on average, there's more disposable income, it's a very attractive market for virtually every company in the world. They want to be in the large emerging market like Russia. For example, the corporations that we at Skolkovo attracted 23 major corporations to build and invest R&D centers in Russia. We struggled to get 2 or 3 in Abu Dhabi. Why? Because there was no local market. They said, why should we do R&D here and send over some of our best scientists? We can't, there's no market to sell these products into. That is not the case in Russia. That's one of the strongest points of Russia. For somebody like you, who is already here, you should be looking for ways and mechanisms that you can leverage the fact that you're Russian, you're in this market, you know how to work in this market. I know it's not easy, but that's where places like Skolkovo and other institutes of development need to come in and play a role of bringing, for example, corporations to whatever product or service you might have, making those introductions and allowing you at a very early stage to get your product or service into the market and get some cash flow so you can develop and grow your company. If you're thinking about going abroad, you can do that, but have no illusions. It's massively more competitive over there, and your product and service may not be competitive.
First of all, thank you for the lecture and the opportunity to discuss. I was following your publication in the RPK Daily and your lessons learned. Let's say I really appreciate the approach you take this and openly share with the public. So my question is, you mentioned that the smart, or let's say achievable, but realistic stretch targets has to be put in front of the company, like, or let's say fund like Skolkovo. So what would be the right smart targets now? What would be the smart goals now? How you see it now as a person who is outside of this fund?
That's a really big question. I don't think we have a lot of time to answer, but I'll basically just take it piece by piece. It's all about filling this gap as soon as possible, as most efficiently as possible, and utilizing the resources, financial resources and administrative resources that the government is entrusting Skolkovo with most efficiently. And how do you do that? Well, let's just break it down piece by piece. I think on the university, great strides have been made. That project is moving ahead very quickly. I am highly confident that the Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology in 10 years will be one of the world's leading research institutes. It will go that fast because Russia has the intellectual and scientific capacity to do that. Whereas Abu Dhabi is successful, but it doesn't have the intellectual and scientific horsepower that a country like Russia does. So that is moving ahead very well. I think it can be improved by making a greater effort to bring in the leading Russian institutes and researchers into those research centers to collaborate closely. They're doing a reasonable job. I'd like to see them do a little better job to bring in some of the smart people from around the country and the institutes to work on projects at Skolkovo and the Skolkovo Institute. Corporates, this is difficult, to be honest. Bringing in the Russian corporates, the Russian government can decree you have to invest 1% of your turnover. I mean, that's basically forcing companies to do it. A better approach is to have a team of people that proactively go out from Skolkovo and approach these people and aggressively it's a process. Sit down and explain why you should be interested in funding research at Skolkovo Institute. What are the competitive advantages your company, however big or small, can gain by doing that? How to use the networks at Skolkovo to access business opportunities externally. This is something that Skolkovo should be, and other development agencies should be more proactive, bringing in the large corporates. Until you convince them that it's in their interest to do it, all the government forcing from the top, sure they'll give money, but that's not what you want. You want their wholehearted participation, because that's where you send interns to do summer jobs. That's where graduates go to work, and that's where some of the money goes in to fund some really exciting research together with international collaborators. That's where you're going to generate some interesting, real international technology. This, I think Skolkovo has done about as well as you could be expected. They brought in virtually the entire existing Russian venture capital community. They've started a couple programs to bring in the angel communities. They tied up with some of the angel communities internationally and VC. So I think they've done a pretty good job on that. I'd give them a B+ or an A on that. Entrepreneurs, numerically there are 700 plus entrepreneurs there. But I think now, and this year, they should be focusing more on qualitative indicators and less on quantitative. But you have to understand that any new project that's facing enormous criticism from all parts of society, you have to show results quickly. And sometimes these are more numerical than qualitative. You don't have the time sometimes to really dig through and find that one jewel because the market and the audience, in this case the Russian community, won't give you enough time for that to prove a success. So in that sense, we hedged our bets. I'll be honest, we hedged our bets at Skolkovo by placing some high-risk bets on things that may change the world, but also placing some bets on some pretty safe things that are most likely going to work that we can claim victory on. A balanced approach, and I think that was the right way to do it. Going forward, 2013, the organization could definitely play a greater role in qualitative and try to increase the amount of international participation in Skolkovo. Why do I keep stressing international? It's not because I'm a foreigner. It's because this is what makes Silicon Valley work. This is what makes Israel work. This is what makes a lot of these projects work, is they're bringing in people from around the world with fresh ideas. And then they might realize we're going down the wrong path. Somebody in another country is 5 years ahead. Let's change. But if that person's not there telling you, you'll just continue on the same path. Government policy and support. I think it's absolutely essential for the government to define its policy after 2014. Because right now, it's just, we're financing the project till 2014, but after that, all bets are off. Maybe there'll be financing, maybe there won't. And I also think that there should be competitors to Skolkovo. This is all about competition. How can you have one organization monopolize competition? It's almost a contradiction in terms. So basically, I think that either certain industries or certain other agencies could also be boosted and also be playing a role. This is a very large country. One organization, however great it is, cannot do everything in innovation that a country this size, a market this size needs. So my other advice is for the government to begin to develop other highly innovative projects like Skolkovo that also can develop other areas that Skolkovo is simply not looking at.
Actually,
Out of time?
Yeah, I think you would ask one or more questions after we finish. So just let's think on the speaker.